Welcome to this very special edition of the KJ Masterclass Live, the show which ensures that you profit from your time spent here with experts, either through their industry insights, information, or simply learning from them. And today we have Deborah Morris. She is an award winning author, historical fiction author. She blends research and storytelling to uncover history's secrets. Welcome to the show, Deborah.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, AJ. I'm so happy to be here with you and your viewers.
You are welcome. Welcome to the show, Deborah. Welcome to India in this online form. And I'm sure not just in India, but a lot of people across the globe will benefit from what we are going to talk about. We'll talk about bringing lost history to life, that what you do, what you have done with this book. So we'll learn all about this. But first, let's learn a bit about your journey, your background, so that people know who they are listening to.
Well, I am someone who loves genealogy. I love history. I graduated from Utah State University in with degrees in music and in theater, actually, and in English. I went on for a master's in English in and hoped to be writing. But my husband was a military person, and that took us all around the world. So I've lived on four continents and have spent much of my life in Europe and some of it on the African and Asian continents as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. Till one day you stumbled across a story which seemed like something from your own past. Tell us about this whole thing about about this girl of many crowns. We'll come to this story, but how did you land to this particular story of yours, and then coming to know about yourself also?
Okay. My aunt, excuse me, my aunt was a genealogist for the family. And I think she wanted me and my husband to take over that role when she died. And because her children were not interested in it, she knew that my husband and I both loved history and genealogy. So she gave me a big chart. On this chart, I traced it back. Several of the lines went back more than 1,000 years. And one of these in particular went back 1,200 years, all the way back to Charlemagne. And I noticed that one girl kept showing up over and over. And I thought, either there's a mistake here that I have to make right, or there's a very strange story. So I started digging into the story of Judith, the great granddaughter of Charlemagne. Why is she appearing here in France, then here in England twice, married? She can't have been married twice within just a couple of years, and only 12 years old, and then 14 years old. And then she is appearing in Flanders a few years later, being married to someone else. And I thought, that's not right. There's got to be a mistake. And so I started doing some research. And the research led me further and further. There's not a lot of research about women. They didn't write a lot about, about women in those days unless they did something scandalous. Well, she did make the history books then, which were kept by the monks. The monks would write each year in their annals what they found of most import during that year. And Judith appears there several times, as does her cousin's wife, who also shows up in the book. That was the major scandal of the probably of of the first part of the century. We're talking 9th century here, so this is a long time ago. And I wondered, how am I going to find out more about her since most people, most historians, focused on her father, Charles, the first king of France, and her great grandfather, Charlemagne. But nobody seemed to focus on Judith. And I was fascinated by her story. And so that is what led me on my journey. And actually, in researching this research journey, I found the most amazing and inspiring and courageous story, and it grabbed onto me, and I couldn't let go of it. And for several decades, I just kept thinking about it. And then finally, during COVID, sorry, during COVID, that is when I really started to gather all the research and put it together and make sense of it. And then I started to write the story, which was an amazing story.
Absolutely amazing indeed. We will come to the story. But when did you actually fully understand that you had some sort of a connection with Judith?
From the beginning, I knew that this was my great grandmother
Right.
way back 1200 years ago. I knew that.
Of course, because your aunt gave this work to you,
Yes.
so obviously that was. But I, from a realization point of view, that you come to know. Okay, so uh, so in your family, do they generally know that you have a sort of a royal connection of that long ago?
Well, they do now.
That's the
I
thing
think,
I want to know, because one is that knowing about history of your family, which your aunt kept a record of, but one is knowing about the royal connection and such a eminent connection in that sense. That is the thing I want to understand for the audience.
I think what I have come to realize is that we often see from a distance the beauty of a crown, the beauty of a palace, how wonderful it is. My research led me to understand what a burden it was as well. There's beauty on one side and there's a burden on the other, and you can't have one without the other. And so I am inspired by the courage that she eventually gets and grows in order to defy her father and the empire. But I can also see the burden that it was for her father, too, to wear the crown, the burden that it was for her brother to wear the crown. We don't see that part of it generally. We just see the glamour and the beauty. And I'm very grateful that I'm not a royal right now.
Right, right. But does it occur to you? You are grateful that you are not a royal, but does it see many people now? This whole concept of genealogy, DNA, and those registry, and those people want to know, that
Yes.
about their ancestry, who they are. In the many people think they have a royal connection, and they are many a times dejected that they don't have. Sometimes it is the story is totally different. I did an interview a few months back with someone who does this for people, and people are certainly either dejected, taken by surprise, or it's not exactly it's fully opposite what they thought, and it can be very difficult for them to digest. In that sense, what was your understanding? Did you feel good, though you were happy, not that you did not have to have the crown, but in that sense of understanding that, okay, this is the history I have.
Um, as I came to understand her story more, then I realized, yes, I am very glad I'm not having to wear the crown. But I think as a younger person, perhaps I just saw, oh, that's so glamorous. What would it have been like? I would have loved doing that. And then as I dug deeper into the history and uncovered all the secrets, the plots, the politics that were involved, the rumors that would be spread in order to achieve a political aim, and the people who are depending on you to make all the right decisions for their lives as well. Your obligation to duty to your country, to your king, to your family, always has to come first. You don't have the freedom to choose to do exactly what you might like to do. You have advantages of being well educated, of being well dressed, of never having to go hungry, of living in beautiful palaces, but it comes at a very dear price, a price of freedom, a price of sometimes sorrow, and being forced to enter into political alliances that you might not wish to. And there's a lot of politics, a lot of scheming, a lot of uh, wars, things going on that become part of your existence every day. You can't just turn off the news and pretend it doesn't exist. It is part of your life. I very much appreciate knowing the rich heritage that I have. It is wonderful. I'm glad I was born when I'm born.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Deborah. So let's get to the story itself. The girl of many crowns. When did you decide to write a book? And as a writer, sometimes it is good to be part of that story. Sometimes it is also good to write it from a certain distance. How did you calibrate your distance from the story? Sometimes people get too close to the story, and sometimes it can be not so good. I want to understand your writing process, especially with something so, related to you.
Mm-hmm. I started by just wanting to write the history for my family so that the family would know. And I started by using the annals that were kept by the monks in the 9th century. And so I started year by year and just wrote what happened that year and tried to keep it as accurate as possible. It turned out that that was a bigger project than I thought it would be. For one thing, I didn't know anything about the 9th century. And when I started to write it, I thought, I don't know how they traveled. I don't know what they wore, what they ate. What was their war like? What were their buildings like? Everything. What was their education like? Their music like? I ended up reading probably 45 books. And some of them in German. There is a huge amount of literature out there about the 9th century. It's just most of it is in Latin. I don't speak or read Latin. I do speak and read German. Thank heaven that there were a number of those were translated into German, so I could at least make use of them. Some of them were also translated into English, but I approached it from this is the year 856. This is what happened. Then this is the year 857. And I researched every time I came to a new place. I had to research, such as, let's say they are in Paris or whatever. Then I would have to see what happened in Paris in the 9th century. I've been to Paris a number of times, but I see it in the 21st century. So I had to put myself back in time and look at older documents and see what was going on in Rome, not today's Rome, but the Rome of the 9th century. And I found it fascinating. I learned a lot. I felt like I'd gotten a master's degree in 9th century Europe by the time I finished writing the book, because for me, I'm not one who can just make up what happened. So all the events that happened were, all the major events were actual events, and I just tried to fill in the gaps and bring them to life, because I didn't want to get to the, I believe, the other side of this life and perhaps run into Judith and she will say, why did you make up all that stuff? So I wanted it to be true as much as I possibly could have it true. So you will see all the politics that are there. You will see all the scandals. You will see the Vikings attacks that were taking place. You will see the deals and the trades and some of the exciting events that took place they're all in the book, and I find them very very inspiring. It's a challenging book and an inspiring book, as well as an entertaining book, because it challenges you to think about things such as loyalty and duty and family relationships and faith, and what kind of role does that play in our life, and what kind of role should it play, and reputation, and dealing with people that you really don't like and are not very good people, but you still have to deal with them. And love, of course. There is a love story in there. It's because it's more of a story of the times and the family. The love story doesn't come till the third part 3 of the book. You can see glimmers of it at the beginning, because the book starts out with young Baldwin Ironarm. That's his real name. He's a knight in shining armor. He's only 16, and he takes service he joins the service of King Charles, who is the first king of France and is desperately fighting to retain his kingdom. And then he is assigned to be the companion of King Charles' young son, Louis. Louis is only 9, but he's expected to become a provincial king before the year is out. And Baldwin Ironarm is going to be his companion, his mentor, and will be willing to lay down his life to protect Louis. Louis's sister, Judith, who they are very close, at the age of 12, as soon as she turns 12, her father arranges a marriage for her to the King of Wessex, who has recently been widowed. He's 50 and has grown sons who expect to inherit his kingdom. Well, King Charles is hoping not only is this going to be a good political alliance, but perhaps I might have a grandson someday sitting on the throne of Wessex. This is in his mind. And so that's where the story begins. And we follow it from three perspectives. We follow it from Baldwin Ironarm, and he is with a companion to Louis. So we see everything that's happening in Neustria, where one of the provinces of King Charles, and we see everything that's happening with Judith as she's sent overseas to be the Queen of Wessex, the first anointed Queen of Wessex. There had never been an anointed Queen of Wessex before. I didn't know that before. They only had, the king had a wife, but she was never called queen and she was never anointed. In fact, we don't have any record of any queen ever being anointed with the holy chrism, which is the holy anointing oil, by the church until Judith. And they did that specifically hoping that this would make any children she had have a greater right to rule in Wessex than the already grown sons. So it was a plot, but she is a widow by the age of 14. She's another arranged marriage. She enters into that, widowed again within a year and a half, has no children. And then at the age of 16, she comes home to France and says, I'm not going to marry again. And her father says, then I will imprison you in the palace and you will stay there until you change your mind. And she knew at that point that she would be willing to be imprisoned for the rest of her life rather than to be forced to marry again. There's also a third perspective this story is told from, and that is from Archbishop Hincmar, who was one of the most prolific writers of the 9th century. And he was also an amazing politician. He was the chief counselor to King Charles. And so we see everything that's happening in politics and war and Viking attacks and assassination plots, everything from his standpoint as well. So when Judith is imprisoned in the castle, she spends about a year in imprisonment, and her brother Louis and Baldwin Ironarm visit her one Christmas when her parents are at another castle and she's all alone. Baldwin and Judith already had a friendship developed before she ever was married, but now it becomes serious. And Baldwin has to choose, do I keep my vow to the king that I made to follow his orders, or do I keep my vow to the king that I made to protect his family? even if that means protecting a member of his family from the king himself. Ultimately, he sides with Judith and he helps her escape from the palace. They are pursued across Europe. They marry and finally go to the Pope and plead for his help. Judith and Baldwin eventually are considered to be the founding couple of Belgium. And in fact, 1,200 years later, I was astonished to find out that the ruler of Belgium still has the name Baldwin and it's come down through all those generations for 1,200 years. They've named their ruler after Baldwin, Iron Arm. It's an amazing story in that she actually has the courage to stand up for herself. And you see in the book where she starts as a pawn of several kings. She wears the crown as a princess. She wears the crown as the Queen of Wessex twice. And then she stands up for herself to her father and the empire and says, no more. I will choose my own path forward. And the good thing is it has a happy ending. A lot of books don't anymore. They were successful, and it went against all odds. And the odds that are portrayed are pretty daunting.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Deborah. So I want to understand for the audience, what was the most challenging part of writing this book?
Well, the research was challenging, but I love research. I actually enjoy it. So I read those 45 books about jewelry, about travel, about everything from the 9th century gladly. And every little discovery was exciting. For me, it was probably the most difficult was trying to pare down all of the information I came across. When my first draft of the book was probably a third larger than it is. And I realized this is reading like a history book. If I want someone to really enjoy it and be inspired by it and love it, then I need to turn all of this history into more of a story. So I had to go through and eliminate everything that people didn't really absolutely have to know in order to understand all the politics, all the things that are going on in the world that made Judith decide to do what she did, to make Baldwin's choice very difficult. And then, so it's her story and his story running parallel, and then they come together in one story in part 3. Everything that I could find that was accurate, I put in there. So, for instance, even the laws that were passed and proposed at that day, I put in there. So it was really difficult to take stuff out too, because I thought, oh, but this is so fascinating. But that's the history lover in me. But I had to cut it to make it a novel rather than a history textbook. And that was the hardest for me, to cut all of this history that I found so fascinating and just put in the basics and still
Absolutely.
keep it a fun story to read.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Deborah, did it ever occur to your mind that if this story, love story, did not succeed, then you would not also be in that whole scheme of the God's scheme of things?
I thought about that. It's a funny thing to think of, isn't it? But we can all put ourselves there with our ancestors. And I think one thing I would love to have is people look back as far as they can into their own genealogy. It's amazing. We have real heroes. We don't have to go to superheroes, Marvel comics. We have real heroes in our own genealogy, in our own stories. Judith took some comfort from her own grandmother, who had an amazing story. And I'm starting to write the prequel based on Judith's grandmother, who was also named Judith. Judith was named for her grandmother, but who was an empress. And she was the second wife also of a king, of an emperor, actually, Louis the Pious, who was the son of Charlemagne. And she also had grown stepsons. And they were okay with the marriage. But as soon as she had given birth to a son who was Judith's father, Charles, King Charles, then all of a sudden they are trying to kill him and kill her and lock her up and lock up their father and start a civil war. And she did everything in her power to preserve her son so that he could be king of France. And I've often thought too that there's a lot of parallels in the book, The Girl of Many Crowns, in the political situation that is there and in what my country is experiencing today. There's a point in the book where Hinkmar, the principal counselor to King Charles, says, "Sire, we have at least 5 major threats to our kingdom right now. And we've dealt with them one at a time, but they're all still there. We have Vikings. We have rebel lords in Aquitaine. We have Robert the Strong, who's taken over Neustria. We have Salomon, who has taken over Brittany. And we also have your brother, Louis the German, who is trying and threatening to invade your country. What if all of these happen at once? What can we do? We need to formulate a plan, how we will respond if everybody attacks at once." And it turns out that this does happen. And King Charles almost loses his kingdom, if not for a miracle. And it was a miracle war that he was involved in. And so there is that element of faith in God, that God loves all of his children, and he does play a role in helping us. And then I think about my own country and I think, okay, we've got drug cartels to the south of us. We have China and Russia who don't like us. Iran doesn't like us. North Korea doesn't like us. We have probably enemies within, terrorists. If all of this were to happen at once, would we survive or would it take a miracle? I don't know. But the thought has occurred to me. And maybe we should be a little more grateful for the little miracles that we experience in our own lives.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Deborah. So, one last thing I want to understand, who is this book for, Deborah?
This book is, that's a very interesting question because I thought I knew who I was writing it for. I was writing it for my family originally, and I thought mainly the girls would like it, right? Well, it turns out that all the males who have read it think that it's a Baldwin Iron Arm adventure and war book with politics and a touch of romance. And all the women who read it think that it's a book of a woman coming of age, growing from being a pawn from the men in her life to becoming um, a strong and powerful woman who can direct her own future, and also with some romance in it as well. As I learned a new term that I hadn't known before. It's called a slow burn romance. Apparently, that means that it just develops naturally and organically and is very more realistic than the norm, I guess. But people have said it was difficult at first to get into the 9th century because I've never read about it. There's a lot of strange names, but once they got into it, they didn't want it to end. And there's an afterword at the end of the book that tells the fate of all the main characters. It only covers 7 years. Those were the more eventful years. Those were the years that Judith shows up in the annals because she was doing things that were of note to the monks, I guess, who really weren't all that interested in what women were doing anyway. But at the end, I did not want to leave my readers hanging, so I included an afterword, and it wraps up every detail of all the characters in the book. So the book really is it's a book for people who love history. It's a book for people who like adventure. It's a book for people who are probably teenage and up, because it is a complex book. And it is a book that would be a great book for like a reading club, because there are so many deep topics and themes that you could have a good discussion about.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Deborah. If you can show the book for the audience so that they know what the book looks like. Yeah, do not let it hide your face.
Can you see it?
I can see it, but you need to show yeah, just put it towards your right so that towards your right. It's hiding your face, Deborah. Yes, that's better. This is better. Great. Great, Deborah. Thank you for that. Now we
Thank
know.
you.
Okay. Now we can see this crown as well as in the backdrop. Also, you've got a couple of crowns there.
So I felt like I had got a master's degree in 9th century Europe from writing it. And I have found a lot of people tell me they felt the same way after reading it. So if you want to know how England, France, Germany, how they were formed, this was the time when they were actually fighting over their borders. And this is how France became France and Germany became Germany. If Louis the German's invasion of King Charles had succeeded, they probably all of Europe would have been speaking German. instead of having all of their different languages. So I found it a fascinating period of time, and I'm very grateful that I had the opportunity to do the research and bring their story to life so that other people might enjoy that as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. Uh, there is so much to learn from you, and so much to learn about history through you, through your book, and so many people would want to get hold of this book. So, what is the best way for them to connect with you and also to get this book?
You can get the book on Amazon. I believe that it should be there. We have a paperback version. We also have an ebook version. And right now, the audiobook is with the editor. So it should be coming out in a month or two. They can have an audio version as well.
Wonderful, wonderful. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of the KJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed for joining
Thank
us.
you. Thank you, AJ.